I never thought a weekend hunting trip could destroy everything I believed about my marriage, until she walked down the stairs wearing nothing but a towel and a dangerous smile. My wife trusted me, but as the fire crackled in the cabin and her best friend whispered secrets I shouldn't have heard, I realized some temptations were impossible to resist. What happened next? I still can't forgive myself for crossing that line. David and Lindsay had been married for nearly 18 years. To most people, they seemed like the perfect couple, steady, loving, and deeply committed. David was a hard-working contractor, known for his reliability and warmth, while Lindsay was a dedicated school counselor admired for her kindness. Together, they had built a life filled with trust, laughter, and shared memories. But beneath the surface, cracks had started to form. Lindsay's demanding job often left her exhausted, and over the years, intimacy between them had dwindled. David tried to be patient, but the emotional and physical distance was growing harder to ignore. Their shared passion for outdoor adventures, especially their annual hunting trips, had always kept them connected. Every fall, they'd escape to their cozy cabin deep in the woods, a place filled with warm memories of bonfires, quiet mornings, and whispered conversations under the stars. It was their sanctuary. This year, however, things were different. Lindsay's work commitments forced her to miss the trip, leaving David disappointed but understanding. What he didn't expect was her suggestion to invite her younger co-worker, Emily, to join him instead. Emily was recently divorced and struggling to rebuild her confidence after a painful betrayal. Lindsay thought the trip might lift Emily's spirits and also ease David's loneliness in her absence. It seemed harmless enough at first. David had met Emily a few times at school events. She was bubbly, attractive, and much younger than him. Still, he saw her as Lindsay's friend and nothing more. But when she stepped into the truck that Friday evening, full of nervous energy and excitement for her first hunting trip, David couldn't help but notice how different she seemed outside of work, free-spirited and uninhibited. The drive to the cabin was filled with laughter and light-hearted conversation, but David pushed away any thoughts that felt inappropriate. He reminded himself of Lindsay's trust in him and the importance of keeping things professional. By the time they reached the cabin, Emily's carefree personality had already started to make David feel more alive than he had in years. But he had no idea just how much temptation lay ahead, or how one weekend could unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The cabin felt different without Lindsay. David tried to focus on setting things up, turning on the power, stacking firewood, and checking their gear, but Emily's constant chatter made it hard to keep his mind on track. She was full of questions, wide-eyed with excitement about her first hunting trip, but there was something else in her tone, something playful, almost flirtatious. David brushed it off as harmless enthusiasm. She was younger, newly single, and probably just looking for attention. Still, when Emily climbed the spiral staircase to the loft, he couldn't ignore how her form-fitting jeans hugged her figure, or the pang of guilt that followed. He forced himself to focus on the fire crackling in the stove and an old war movie playing in the background. But then he heard Emily's voice calling down from the loft. "Mind if I use the shower?" David cleared his throat. "Go ahead." Minutes later, the sound of running water filled the cabin. David tried not to think about her, but when she descended the stairs wrapped in a towel that barely covered her, his pulse quickened. She moved with confidence, her damp hair clinging to her shoulders, and when she bent to grab her toiletries, the towel shifted just enough to make David avert his eyes. "This place is amazing," she said, flashing him a smile as she disappeared into the bathroom. David shook his head, silently chastising himself. "She's your wife's friend. Stop it." But the soft sound of her humming in the shower kept pulling his thoughts back to her. His imagination wandered, and before he could stop himself, he pictured her, bare, wet, and vulnerable just on the other side of the thin wooden door. He jumped up and stepped outside, letting the cool night air clear his head. "This is ridiculous," he thought. "Lindsay trusts you. Don't ruin that." When he came back inside, Emily was sitting cross-legged on the sofa, wearing tiny shorts and a cropped tank top. She was holding a jar of peanut butter and chatting as if nothing had happened. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, just needed some air," David replied, trying to sound casual. Emily grinned. "I hope I'm not making you uncomfortable. Lindsay said you'd be a great teacher, and a great guy to talk to." Her words felt innocent, but the way she leaned closer as she spoke made David's chest tighten. He reminded himself again that she was vulnerable, newly single, and probably just craving attention. She doesn't mean anything by it, he thought. But later that night, As he lay in bed and heard Emily moving around in the loft above him, he couldn't shake the image of her in that towel, or the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. The next morning, things only got worse. Emily came down wearing nothing but an oversized shirt and knee-high socks, stretching in a way that revealed smooth tan thighs. David felt his resolve cracking. He tried to stay focused on the hunt, explaining safety tips and rifle handling. But every time she leaned close to ask a question, or brushed against him as they walked through the woods, the tension built. When they finally settled into the hunting blind, the small space felt suffocating. Emily shifted in her seat, her leg resting against his, and whispered, "It's so quiet out here. Kind of intimate, don't you think?" David swallowed hard. "I guess so." The deer never showed up, but the electricity between them only grew stronger. By the time they returned to the cabin that afternoon, David knew he was in trouble. The tension between David and Emily had become impossible to ignore. Every glance lingered too long, every accidental touch felt deliberate, and the cabin, once a cozy retreat, now seemed like a trap, isolated and filled with temptation. After dinner, Emily leaned back against the sofa, stretching her legs out and sipping a glass of wine. "I never imagined hunting could be this relaxing," she said, her voice soft and teasing. David chuckled nervously, pretending to focus on cleaning his rifle. "It's not always this peaceful. Tomorrow will be busier." Emily's eyes sparkled as she leaned closer. "I think I like the quiet moments better." David felt his heart race as she shifted even closer, her bare knee brushing against his thigh. He knew he should move away, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed frozen, as if caught in a spell. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Sure," David replied, his voice strained. "Do you ever feel unappreciated?" Her eyes locked onto his, and he saw something raw, vulnerability mixed with desire. David hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted quietly. Emily reached out and touched his hand. "Me too. My ex made me feel invisible, like I wasn't enough." "You are enough," David said before he could stop himself. Her lips parted slightly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than words ever could. Then, without warning, Emily shifted closer, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." "You didn't," David said, but the words felt hollow. The moment stretched, and before he realized what was happening, Emily turned toward him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "You're a good man, David," she whispered. "Lindsay's lucky to have you." David's pulse pounded in his ears. "Emily." But she leaned in, her lips hovering dangerously close to his. "You can tell me to stop," she said softly. He should have. Every rational thought screamed at him to pull away. But when her lips finally brushed against his, he didn't stop her. Instead, he kissed her back, tentatively at first, then with growing hunger. Her fingers tangled in his hair, and his hands moved instinctively to her waist, pulling her closer. The crackling fire seemed to fade as the world narrowed to just the two of them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I shouldn't have done that," David muttered. "Neither should I," Emily replied. But her eyes said something different. She stood, taking his hand and leading him toward the loft. "No one has to know," she whispered. David hesitated at the base of the stairs, his mind racing. But when Emily reached the top and let her shirt slip off one shoulder, revealing smooth, bare skin, his resolve crumbled. The next moments passed in a blur of heated kisses and tangled sheets. Emily's touch felt electric, her body warm and inviting. For the first time in years, David felt wanted, desired in a way that reignited something inside him he thought had died. But as the passion faded and reality crept back in, guilt hit him like a tidal wave. He lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, unable to ignore the weight of what he'd done. What had started as innocent flirtation had crossed a line he couldn't undo. And as Emily nestled closer, her breath warm against his skin, David couldn't help but wonder. Had he just destroyed his marriage? David woke before dawn, the weight of guilt pressing down on his chest as heavily as the blankets tangled around him. Emily stirred beside him, her body curled into his like they'd been lovers for years instead of strangers crossing forbidden lines. He slipped out of bed carefully, dressing in silence while his mind raced. "What have I done?" The echo of that question followed him as he stepped outside, letting the cold morning air sting his skin and clear his thoughts. But no amount of fresh air could erase the memory of Emily's lips, her touch, or the way she had whispered his name in the dark. He had betrayed Lindsay, the woman who trusted him, who loved him, and now, no matter what he did, there was no going back. By the time he returned to the cabin, Emily was awake, sitting at the kitchen table wearing nothing but his flannel shirt. "Morning," she said softly, as if what they'd done was the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," David replied, his voice hollow. Emily stood and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You okay?" David stepped back, breaking her hold. "Emily, last night shouldn't have happened." Her face fell. "David, it wasn't just me. You wanted it too." He shook his head. "That doesn't make it right." Before Emily could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel froze them both. "Who's that?" Emily whispered, stepping toward the window. David's stomach dropped. He already knew the answer. The door opened and Lindsay stepped inside, smiling warmly. "Surprise," she said, holding up a bag of groceries. "I got back early and thought I'd bring breakfast." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the messy blankets on the sofa, the half-drained wine bottle, and Emily, still wearing David's shirt. The color drained from Lindsay's face. What's going on here?" David opened his mouth to explain, but Emily beat him to it. "I can explain," Emily said quickly, stepping forward. But Lindsay's eyes had already filled with tears. "Don't. Just don't." "Lindsay, wait," David started, reaching for her. She stepped back. "Don't touch me." Her voice cracked, and the hurt in her eyes was enough to shatter David's heart. "Please, it's not what it looks like," he lied, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were useless. Lindsay shook her head. "I trusted you, David. I trusted you with her." Emily looked at Lindsay helplessly. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean." "But it did," Lindsay snapped, cutting her off. "It did happen." The silence that followed was unbearable. David wanted to reach out, to fix what he had broken, but the damage was already done. Finally, Lindsay turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind her. David chased after her, but she was already climbing into her car. "Lindsay, please," he begged, pounding on the window. She rolled it down just enough to speak. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she said, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, she drove away, leaving him standing alone in the gravel driveway. When David turned back toward the cabin, Emily was standing in the doorway, clutching the edges of the flannel shirt around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but David couldn't even look at her. He walked past her, his legs heavy as he sank down onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. Hours passed, but the ache in his chest only grew worse. He tried calling Lindsay, but she didn't answer. Texts went unread. By nightfall, David knew the truth. He might never get her back. The cabin felt emptier than ever as night fell. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams as the fire in the stove dimmed. David sat at the table, staring blankly at the untouched dinner Emily had made. She sat across from him, eyes red and puffy from crying. "I didn't mean to ruin your marriage," she said softly, breaking the silence. David's jaw tightened. "You didn't." "I did." Emily flinched at the sharpness in his voice, but David didn't care. He wasn't angry at her, he was angry at himself. The reality of what he had done was sinking in deeper with every passing hour. Lindsay's face, her tears, and the way her voice cracked when she told him she didn't know who he was anymore haunted him. "I should go," Emily said, pushing her chair back. David didn't stop her. Part of him wanted her gone, to erase the reminder of his betrayal. But another part of him hated how empty the cabin would feel without her presence. When the door shut behind her, David exhaled deeply, his chest aching. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through the unanswered calls and texts to Lindsay. "I'm sorry. Please talk to me. I made a terrible mistake. I love you. I need you." None of it mattered. She wasn't responding. The next morning, David returned home to a half-empty house. Lindsay's clothes were gone, her wedding ring left on the nightstand like a silent accusation. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his palm, and sank onto the bed. He had always thought their marriage could survive anything. They had weathered financial struggles, illnesses, and disagreements, but this was different. Days turned into weeks, and Lindsay refused to come home. When they finally met, it was in a lawyer's office, her eyes distant and guarded. "This doesn't have to mean the end," David said desperately. "It already is," Lindsay replied, her voice flat. "You made a choice, David. And so am I." David fought to hold back tears as he signed the divorce papers, but Lindsay didn't cry. She was too broken to cry anymore. In the weeks that followed, David tried to move on, but the guilt clung to him like a shadow. Friends stopped calling, and family gatherings felt strained. People whispered when he walked into rooms. Emily reached out a few times, but David ignored her messages. Whatever they had shared wasn't love, It was desperation and loneliness colliding at the wrong moment. One night, he drove back to the cabin, hoping for clarity. Instead, he found echoes of that night everywhere. The smell of the fire, the sight of the couch where they'd first kissed, and the bed where he had betrayed the woman who trusted him most. He picked up a photo of Lindsay they had left on the mantel, running his fingers over the glass. How had he let this happen? The answer came to him slowly. It wasn't one moment, it was a series of small choices. Ignoring the distance in their marriage, letting his loneliness fester, failing to fight temptation when it mattered most. By the time he left the cabin, David knew one thing for sure. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that weekend. David sat alone in his now too quiet house, the walls echoing with memories of a life he had taken for granted. Everywhere he looked, reminders of Lindsay lingered. Her favorite mug on the counter, a half-read book on the nightstand, the scent of her perfume still faint in the air. It felt like a ghost lived there, and he couldn't escape her presence or his guilt. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of his actions didn't lift. He tried to distract himself with work, but nothing filled the hollow space Lindsay had left. Friends and family avoided the subject, treating him with quiet judgment or pity. And Emily? She faded from his life as quickly as she had entered it, leaving only a stain he couldn't wash away. David replayed that night at the cabin over and over in his mind, looking for an excuse, a justification, something to explain why he had crossed that line. But there was none. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't manipulated. He had simply let his guard down, convincing himself that one mistake wouldn't ruin his marriage. But it had. In the months that followed, David sought therapy, desperate to make sense of his choices. He learned that his actions weren't just about temptation, they were rooted in deeper issues: neglect, insecurity, and a fear of being unwanted. Lindsay had pulled away emotionally, and instead of confronting the problem, he had filled the void with someone else. That realization didn't fix what he had broken, but it gave him perspective. He started to rebuild himself, one painful step at a time. Lindsay, however, moved on. She didn't look back, and David didn't blame her. He saw her once months later at the grocery store. She looked happy, lighter, freer. She even smiled at him, but it wasn't the smile of a wife. It was the polite, distant smile of someone who had closed a chapter and wasn't looking to reopen it. David learned the hard way that some mistakes can't be undone. He had shattered the trust that took years to build, and no apology, no amount of regret, could put the pieces back together. He often wondered what might have happened if he had just said no that night, if he had pulled away instead of leaning in. But regret was a cruel companion, always reminding him of what he'd lost. The cabin became a place he couldn't visit anymore. He sold it, unable to face the memories it held. It was a fresh start, but the scars remained. Through his therapy and self-reflection, David came to understand a painful truth. Trust is fragile, and love, no matter how strong, can break when neglected. He realized that relationships need constant care, not just when things are easy, but especially when they're hard. His story served as a warning, not just to himself, but to anyone willing to listen. Temptation doesn't destroy marriages, he'd later tell a friend. Neglect does. And if you don't face your problems, you'll look for comfort in all the wrong places. He hoped his experience could stop someone else from making the same mistake. But for David, the lesson came too late. What would you do if you were in David's shoes? Could his marriage have been saved, or was it doomed the moment temptation walked in? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shocking tales of love, betrayal, and secrets. You won't believe what's coming next.